So during my presentation, I will talk about multiculturalism, and I will try to approach it from a very, or moderately critical perspective. And I raise a question whether multiculturalism is good enough today. But before we start, let me check whether I can use it. Like this? No. Like this? No. Yes. Before we start, we should know what we are actually talking about. What do I mean by multiculturalism? So I would like to talk about it today as a system of incorporation of immigrants into the society. So the focus will be on policy and on immigrants and their children and grandchildren generally. And internationally, there is a broad criticism of multiculturalism, and it was voiced especially in Australian, Canadian, and American context. And here I'm presenting some chosen elements of this criticism, which I will develop further in my presentation. So first of all, multiculturalism seeks inclusion, but it rather enforces exclusion. And what does it mean? Multicultural policies usually provide immigrants with access to labor market, to education, healthcare. In Norway, they are providing housing, trying to provide good housing conditions, but immigrants are not assumed as a part of a norm. And this is a bit problematic. They are participants of the society, but in the same time, they are outsiders in this society they participate within. Another problem of multiculturalism defined in this international context is that it allows cultural expression, but only in a form of folklore. So anything that goes deeper, anything that relates to some problematic or alternative cultural patterns is outlawed or not accepted. And what is accepted is folklore. And then multiculturalism operates with an essentialist idea of culture as a closed entity. Within multicultural societies, groups are seen as closed entities, as I said. The dominant group, then smaller minorities, all of them closed without any fusion between them. And it enforces focusing on differences rather than similarities between people. And further consequences are that immigrants, minorities are stigmatized because always the difference comes forward. So now I will move to multiculturalism in Norway, and I will try to see, to find out whether those problems that I discussed and they were defined within the international context are valid here in Norway. But before we start, it was already raised, this issue was already raised here. Do we have any multiculturalism in Norway? Because Norwegian immigration policy is not officially labeled as multicultural. And yes, some researchers say yes, because Norwegian immigration policy uses tools and has principles that are reflecting multiculturalism as it is exercised in different countries. And before we start criticizing, just a quick reminder, those are official principles of official immigration policy. And as you can see, those principles provide immigrants or recommend to provide immigrants with access to labor market, to education, to healthcare, provide good housing conditions. So even though it may work differently in different municipalities, they are good and they are trying really to include people within the Norwegian society. But the question is whether immigrants are assumed as a norm or still not. And now I'm moving to talking about sins of Norwegian multiculturalism. So first of all, there is a tendency of prioritizing Norwegian values over values of ethnic minorities or minorities at all. Rather ethnic, I mean here. And there are research that proves that, for example, in healthcare sector, Norwegian is understood as competencies in Norwegian language, also competencies in Norwegian culture codes are sometimes more crucial than actual competencies in healthcare if it comes to promotion. And the consequence of this is that the whole quality of health sector is lowered, because when one gets promoted, one with immigrant background gets promoted just because one has competencies in Norwegianness, that is, speaks Norwegian, then and not because one is good in healthcare per se, then of course the quality goes down. Another research proves that Norwegianness is crucial in child upbringing. And this research gives an example of refugee families who came to Norway, and shortly after that, their adolescent children started activities that were not accepted by the parents. So the parents introduced a kind of control. And this was, of course, not appreciated by Norwegian childcare services. And the adolescents were recommended to live outside the family so as to get rid of this control. And two separate cases, and what happened to this adolescent after a few months? All of them drop out of school. So it shows clearly that using Norwegian principles actually here to these refugee families where children grew up in a completely different system just failed and brought quite negative consequences. But it also shows that alternative patterns of behavior are not accepted as cultural expression. Patterns of behavior are not accepted, and cultural expression is just limited to folklore. As on this picture, this is a widely accepted and very fine språk- og kulturfestival in Drammen. Yeah. So prioritizing Norwegianness has to do with something that I called giver-receiver relationship. And this is also something that I identified here in Norway. But it's not only the Norwegian problem. It's very common also, for example, in Australia. The dominant society is seen as a giver of material support, as a giver of particular values, civilized values, and immigrants and their children are considered as receivers, those who get, not those who contribute. And this is reflected in Norway by the discourse of them, immigrants using our social benefits, for example, also by the idea of sharing civilized values, which materializes, for example, in trainings for immigrants on Norwegian culture, or on highly criticized workshops for immigrant men on how to treat women. And the rhetoric that stands behind it, the intentions may be well, but the rhetoric is a bit problematic because it assumes that immigrants do not know anything, that they are not civilized, and us, Norwegians, are giving them what they need, are giving them kind of civilized values. And this is a kind of a position where prejudices come to the fore, and superiority of Western culture as well comes to the fore. And this giver-receiver rhetoric is repeated within immigrant communities itself. And for example, this is the example from the Norwegian Turkish community in Drammen, where I did my research. And Norwegian Turkish woman Hatice says that her uncle always said, "You were raised here, you have received so much from Norwegian society, therefore you must give something back. You must contribute something to the society." So even though she was born and raised here, she still has to be grateful and give something back to the society. Another thing. Are immigrants and their children considered as a part of a norm in Norway? Are they Norwegians or not? Do they have rights to call themselves Norwegians or not? And unfortunately, my research proved that not really. There is always someone who reminds immigrants and their children born and raised in Norway that they are not from here, by asking, for example, where do you really come from? And why they ask that? Because of the skin color, because of clothing, things like that, not because of accent. In Norwegian, because they don't have any accent. They speak dialects and are just perfect in Norwegian. And again, example from the Romanian Turkish community. Aisha says, she problematizes the idea of home, and she says, Turkey is my homeland. When I arrived there, I'm undoubtedly at home. However, when I'm in Norway, I'm of course foreign. I do not feel at home in Turkey because they say that you are from abroad there. I feel home in Norway. But on the other hand, in Norway, even though one forgets that one is foreign, the others will never forget it. And next thing, boundaries of culture. So I already said that multiculturalism sees societies as multicultural societies as comprising of closed entities, closed ethnic groups, the dominant society and some other ethnic groups. And then I pose a question, where is the boundary between dominant and ethnic? Where is the boundary between Norwegian and immigrant? For example, here, this is a celebration, the picture taken during the celebration of May 17 in Drammen. And where is this boundary? Are we able to draw it even? Or here, people wearing bunat and combining bunats with Islamic veils. Minority children waving Norwegian flags. Where is the boundary? Are we able to mark it or not? Again, Drammen, Norwegian-Turkish ethnic club, and the symbolics inside it. King Olaf, right? And then Atatürk, the founder of Turkish Republic, being just displayed together. So I think the boundary between Norwegian and immigrant ethnic is not really possible to be drawn today, especially if it comes to well-settled minorities in Norway, while multiculturalism actually enforces these boundaries. And it's not that only me or only I'm criticizing multiculturalism. There is also some other criticism in Norwegian literature of multiculturalism. For example, Unni Vikant, who calls it a generous betrayal. And she refers here also to cultural expression, but from a completely different angle that I discussed during this presentation. She says that there are vulnerable groups within immigrant families, and now if we allow free cultural expression, how can we possibly protect those vulnerable groups, like, for example, children or women? And Hagelund actually summarizes this problem well. She asked the question how to provide freedom in maintaining ethnic culture while securing full individual rights. And to this, I add my question, how can we provide that we are not so normative if it comes to this cultural expression? How can we find ways in which we will recognize whether cultural expression, alternative patterns of parenting work well, and when they should be really interrupted by childcare services? Yeah. So, is any alternative needed? I think yes, and here I'm summarizing the problems of multiculturalism that I already mentioned. And I would like you to focus on the last problem. Multiculturalism does not provide immigrants and their children with the ways to be accepted as real Norwegians. And this is very problematic, as some researchers, Martin Yellow, for example, point out. Well, everybody needs a consistent identities, consistent narratives of themselves. And if immigrants and their children are denied access to European identities, then they have to find alternative identities that they can stick to. And those identities tend to be very radical in some cases. And this is, of course, what we do not need and do not want in Europe or anywhere. So the alternative that I'm proposing is called post-ethnicity. And of course, there is a long way to achieve it. This is a possible direction of developing of multiculturalism. And this is, of course, just a theoretical base on which practices should be built. But this post-ethnicity proposes to more open and more voluntary ways of acquiring ethnicity. So in other words, it thinks it is not correct that the blood of my grandmother defines me today. I should be more free to choose who I am, where I grew up. Yeah. And to implement this post-ethnicity, first of all, researchers say the societies has to deal with inequalities. This is the first step. And then I add that we have to deal with approaches to belonging, because for now in Europe they tend to be very autochthonous, very rooted, connected to blood, and this has to change. And for today, that's it. Tack för mig.